At but a single word from Horus, half of the Space Marine legions betrayed their oaths and waged war upon the Imperium. By his command in the distant Istvan system, the fires of treachery were ignited, extinguishing the lives of millions of loyal souls. The flame of rebellion rapidly spread throughout the Imperium. Legions clashed against one another. Brother raised sword against brother, eventually engulfing the entire galaxy in civil war. Meanwhile, on Mars, a schism arose within the Mechanicum as the Fabricator General pledged allegiance to the War Master, who ensnared him with secrets and forbidden technology once concealed by the Emperor. All manner of mechanical horrors were forged in traitorous manufactories and unleashed upon the Imperium, as science intertwined with the forces of the Immaterium to birth monstrosities reminiscent of the horrors of the old night. In the meantime, on Terra, beneath his palace, the master of mankind was engaged in a great labour beyond the comprehension of mere mortals. Thus was Rogel Dawn, the Praetorian of Terra, honoured with the task of staunching the Imperium's hemorrhaging. The throne world was secure, its defences sharpened by the keen mind of the Praetorian and the hands of his legionaries. Yet little else within the incomprehensibly vast borders of the Imperium lay beneath Dawn's aegis. Entire sectors burned across the galaxy whilst Dawn stood apart and isolated, for his loyal brothers were scattered and disoriented by Horus's machinations before his vile treachery was unveiled, or were forced into battle unprepared and with no hope of salvation. Those who turned against the Imperium destroyed all they once fought for, and carved their own dominions among the stars. In the galaxy's north, the War Master forged the Dark Imperium, subjugating the worlds he once brought to compliance. Horus enslaved their peoples and seized material wealth to fuel his conquests. From his throne aboard the vengeful Spirit, the War Master commanded tens of thousands of worlds, yet the sole prize that interested him remained beyond his reach. Terra was forever his ultimate aim, all other worlds merely steps towards final victory. Only the fall of his father's stronghold could assure him legitimacy as the new and dreadful emperor, the only fulfillment for Horus's desire to stand above the shattered and vanquished corpse of his father, grasping the galaxy entire in his grasp. That was where his dark and duplicitous fate led him throughout his lifetime. In the final years of the conflict between the traitors and the Imperium, there was but one true obstacle remaining for Horus. That obstacle was the Garmin star cluster, an ancient bastion of humanity and the earliest conquest of the Great Crusade, encompassing several major star systems whose industrial capabilities and populations exceeded those of any other imperial region, as well as dozens of lesser clusters and outposts of humanity. During the Great Crusade, the Garmin star cluster served as the main logistics hub and assembly point for expeditionary fleets directed towards the galactic east and north. By the Crusade's end, this region had become the jewel of the Imperium's efforts to spread the Emperor's light across the galaxy, a fortified bastion protecting the heart of the Imperium from external threats. No truly significant fleet traveling from the distant reaches of the Imperium to Terra could reach humanity's cradle without passing through the Garmin star cluster. That Horus's rebellion would encompass Garmin was evident from the beginning and was considered by the Imperial command as an inevitable fact. No seasoned warlord could overlook the significance of this cluster, and Horus's pride and arrogance did not dull his strategic acumen. War would descend upon Garmin not suddenly, like a thunderclap, unexpected and blinding, but slowly and insidiously, like a creeping disease that would envelop the cluster and consume it entirely. Those Imperium lords who regarded the destruction of Istvan as the loss of an insignificant system would be shown the harsh truth of Horus's rebellion in the Beta Garmin star cluster. They had to understand that this was not some fleeting disaster, but a catastrophe that would shake the Imperium to its foundation and endanger the very future of humanity. Truly, it was an age of darkness, years of blood and death. No treatise can fully describe the extent of the war for Garmin. Here, in brief, is the history of the earliest years of that dreadful conflict, so that the noteworthy events of which this volume will speak may be placed in their proper time and context. In the distant galactic north, Horus turns the warriors of his legions against each other on the world of Istvan III, insignificant to the Great Crusade, to cleanse his ranks of those who might yet oppose him. Against all odds, loyalists from the sons of Horus, the Death Guard, the World Eaters, and the Emperor's children resist Horus, forcing him to remain on Istvan far longer than anticipated. However, one valiant warrior, Captain Nathaniel Garrow of the Death Guard, manages to seize control of one of the cruisers and escape to warn Terra's lords and the Emperor of the rebellion. Even before the fires ignited by Horus on Istvan had cooled, Horus's agents started their duplicitous activities. By sowing discord and committing assassinations on numerous worlds and outposts in the Garmin star cluster, the first to fall under the knives of Horus's dark commissars were the outer worlds and minor lords of the Garmonian conclave, notably the vast prison complexes of Zeta Garmon and the migratory agri-worlds of Delta Garmon. Entire dominions in the lesser Minoris Garmon outpost of the cluster would fall silent, either subverted to serve the War Master or slaughtered to serve as a lesson to the remaining worlds of the cluster. In one of the most infamous battles of the Age of Darkness, Horus lures a fleet sent against him into an ambush. Of the vast number of space marines dispatched to destroy him, half turn out to be traitors, while loyalists are exterminated by the thousands. Few survive, fleeing some to the bastion of Baal, others returning to Terra through the Garmon star cluster, sowing fear and distrust in their wake. Many of those who were once steadfast in their loyalty begin to doubt, while those secretly devoted to Horus eagerly await the day when they can finally begin their own conquests. In the 6th year of the 31st millennium, a massive fleet traverses the cluster, moving towards Istvan, dispatched by Rogel Dawn to quell Horus's rebellion before it can spread further. Lady Iriana Vale has dispatched 3 full regiments of Imperial militia gathered from her domains to fight under Dawn's command, providing munitions and provisions for his fleet. Meanwhile, Zeta Garmon, still gripped by internal discord and lacking a single lord capable of wielding the scepter of rule over its domains, refuses to fulfill its ancient tithe treaties. Driven by Dawn's urgent orders and the pressures of destiny, the fleet does little to right the wrongs inflicted by indifference or reward the unwavering loyalty of others. Instead, the fleet simply departs the system for the grim pages of history, undoubtedly intending to restore order upon their return to the Garmon star cluster, not anticipating the fate that awaits them. 6th year of the 31st millennium. Death haunts the Garmon star cluster. Weeks after the retreat of the battered survivors of Istvan through the Garmon star cluster, dozens of minor lords, warlords, and astropaths are found dead. Discord and terror swiftly follow each death in the domains of the fallen rulers. Reports of sabotage emerge, including the destruction of solar siphons on Alpha Garmon 9, the explosion of agrodome structures on Delta Garmon 2, and a mutiny in the void docks of Theta Garmon 10. Fear reigns among the higher echelons of power in the Garmon star cluster. Every lord and pontifex fears becoming the next target, leading to the convocation of a conclave of the cluster's lords in Nurkon City on the world of Beta Garmon 2, located at the very heart of the cluster. 6th year of the 31st millennium. The first battle for Paramar. The key system of Paramar, located just a step away from the Garmon star cluster, comes under attack by Alpha Legion forces loyal to Horus. Paramar is stormed and its defenders annihilated. Thus the planet became a brutal example of what awaits all who do not bend the knee. Only a small contingent of loyal Iron Warriors manages to escape, taking refuge in the catacombs beneath Paramar. 6th year of the 31st millennium, the fall of the Conclave. A detachment of Legion Astartes, transmitting the identification code of those retreating from distant Istvan, arrives in Garmon. These forces are granted permission to resupply at Beta Garmon, and their arrival coincides precisely with the fateful conclave of the Lords of Garmon. For several days, Nurkon City plunges into silence, and when communication is restored, Lady Palatine and many other Lords of Garmon are ordered to step down from their duties, leaving the newly formed Council of Regents to manage the Beta-Garmon system. Many inhabitants perceive this news as a veiled coup led by renegades from the Legiones Astartes, and thus the new Council of Regents immediately declares martial law and harshly suppresses dissenters. The 7th year of the 31st millennium, the flames of war ignite. A year after the creation of the Council of Regents, the treachery committed by the lords who sold their allegiance to Horus and his rebels is finally revealed on Beta-Garmon. Discord engulfs Beta-Garmon as loyal militia commanders, established shortly before the coup by direct order of Lady Vale, attempt to restore power to Lady Palatine, fighting against the Legiones Astartes of the Emperor's children and the Titans of Legio Mortis. When news of this reaches other systems in the Garmon clusters and surrounding regions, dozens of nearby fleets responding to pleas for aid become embroiled in the escalating conflict on both sides. As the flames of rebellion spread, the war consumes the entire cluster, as bloody battles erupt everywhere between the traitorous lords and those who remain loyal to the Emperor. The 7th year of the 31st millennium, a destructive storm. For unknown reasons, a warp storm unprecedented since the Age of Strife envelops the galaxy. It engulfs the Garmon clusters, and warp routes that had remained stable for millennia now, overwhelmed by the raging storms, become impassable. Hundreds of fleets go missing attempting to reach the Garmon cluster. Meanwhile, communication with the region almost completely ceases. The 10th year of the 31st millennium, the first battle for Nearcon City. An assault force of the Imperial Fists, supported by 2 cohorts of Solar Auxilia warriors and Titans of Legio Astorum, breaks through the storm surrounding the Garmon star cluster and rushes to the aid of the Loyalist regiments on Beta-Garmon. Thus begins a bloody war of attrition, during which the Imperial Fists lay siege to Nearcon City for several months. The stalemate ends with the arrival of the Ebon Drake, the ship of the Salamander's Legion under the command of Chaplain Lieutenant Giaphus Jur, who delivers a swift strike to the ranks of the traitors. Seizing the opportunity of the orbital assault, the Imperial Fists drive the traitors out of Nearcon City and restore Imperial rule. However, despite the morale boost following the return of the rightful ruler, Imperial forces continue to wage a fierce war across Beta-Garmon II. The 12th year of the 31st millennium. The destructive storm abates. The navigators trapped in the Garmon cluster notice that warp routes are becoming less turbulent. Though they remain perilous, a certain stability returns to them. Shortly after, contact with sectors beyond the Garmon cluster is re-established as the deadly storm finally recedes. The Garmon cluster is once again linked to the entire galaxy, and fleets begin to converge here. Most of them come with sinister intentions, for they are the harbingers of the army of Horus, bearing promises of conquest and destruction. Battles intensify throughout the Garmon cluster as the voice of dawn reaches from Terra, urging all warriors loyal to the Emperor to gather in the Garmon cluster in a final attempt to halt the siege of Terra. Though Horus skillfully sowed discord, slaughter and war throughout the Garmon cluster, he did not control these vital gatehouses to Segmentum Solar. Yet neither Dawn nor any other loyal lord could claim that they themselves held the cluster. Indeed, it was enmeshed in a web of wars, both small and large, such that no warlord could lay claim to control over more than a single world or city. Whole planets burned in space, their inhabitants killed or forcibly armed to fight elsewhere in the cluster, and few of those who fought remembered what they fought for, as each no longer hoped for a great victory but merely to survive. The terms traitor and loyalist began to lose meaning, for every lord and general cared primarily for their own little kingdom, viewing all others as enemies. Millions had already perished, and most of the outer systems had been consumed by war. There were no civilians left on the outskirts of the cluster, only armies vying for the last remnants of a once proud civilization. Worlds located at the heart of the cluster fared better, and many of them could still boast undefeated cities and living people who needed protection, as well as wealth to be amassed, and hope that they might still survive. Here, the great armies of the cluster and their allies, who had breached the veil of the deadly storm, stood in grim stalemate, for neither side had the strength to drive the enemy from their bastions. Yet they continued to fight, conducting raids and skirmishes, sapping each other's strength, though they had not yet reached the brink of mutual annihilation. Ironically, the deadly storm saved them from the worst manifestations of war, for it kept the massive fleets of both sides at bay. Neither Horus nor Dawn dared to dispatch large forces into the heart of this turmoil, fearing that any advantage gained from a first strike would turn into naught but ships torn asunder in the raging warp. For more than 5 years war raged in the Garmon cluster, while beyond its borders, Horus, tearing through the Imperium, drew ever closer to the cluster's edge. Ultramar was devastated, Baal surrounded and bled dry, Inwit besieged, Paramar sundered, each of the Emperor's bastions isolated and ruined. Now the enemy stood at the gates of humanity's cradle, for in the 12th year of the 31st millennium, Horus, at the helm of his great armada, began his advance towards Terra. All his other foes had been shattered, distracted, or had joined his cause, granting him a brief window during which he was the singularly greatest warlord in all the Imperium. As if guided by an unseen hand, the ruinous storm began to abate, and Horus commenced the final movement of his great symphony of war. The gates to Terra were ajar, unlocked by treachery and blood, but they had not yet swung fully open, as loyalists still held key worlds in the Beta Garmon system, which needed to be broken before the arrival of Horus's main fleets, as the warlord wished to brook no delays in the assault on Terra, lest his enemies recover and rally against him as one. Alone, none of the loyal commanders could surpass him, but together they would leave his forces too weakened to claim Terra for himself and overthrow the Emperor. He could not afford for the main part of his fleet to be forced to spend effort on capturing Beta Garmon, as the deployment of his enormous hosts and ground forces would take months, and their recovery and advance to Terra even longer. Moreover, he could not leave Beta Garmon behind in loyalist hands, as this would sever the lines of his forces in the galactic north and endanger the siege of Terra. Dawn, who had always been a master of defense, also clearly saw this weakness, and thus issued his desperate rallying cry to gather forces in the Garmon star cluster. He weighed the value of every life, every ship and every world, and assessed how much time they could buy him to fortify Terra, as some could be spent most advantageously in Beta Garmon. Even disorganized and leaderless, these lives would serve the objectives of Terra's Praetorian, for they would delay Horus's control over Garmon and perhaps force him into months or even years of bloody conflict, necessary to pacify the system and secure the warp routes that would bring his armada to Terra. It was a brutal and heartless strategy. At the cost of millions of lives, Dawn sought not victory, but merely to stave off possible defeats. Horus's response was as direct and bloody as Dawn's. From his huge and cumbersome fleet he allocated a 10th portion, vanguards of 10,000 ships and several million warriors, and directed them to the Garmon star cluster. They were to clear his path and either destroy the enemy or deprive them of the opportunity to delay his main armada. Their ultimate goal was simple: to capture or destroy the Beta Garmon system. This system was located at the very heart of the cluster, containing the most cities, the most fleets, and the key centers of governance. As long as it remained in the hands of the Loyalists, Horus's forces could not advance on Terra, and therefore it had to fall. Nurkan's city, the capital of the system, had to be captured, and the eye of Horus raised upon its spires. Such was Horus's demand. True war, heartless and cruel, had come to the Garmon star cluster. Few could comprehend the dreadful depths to which it would sink, and even fewer would survive to regret the deeds committed in the name of Horus. For what was begun by the War Master's lies and foolish greed could not simply end. It was destined to engulf the entire cluster and stain the name of the Garmon sector upon the pages of history. The great slaughter was on the brink of beginning. Zeal is a double-edged sword, capable of cutting both friend and foe. For once awoken in war, with hands bloodied in the crucible of battle, what was once unthinkable becomes commonplace. The gates of mercy slam shut, and death strides the land with no pangs of conscience. The waning wrath of the fatal storm could no longer restrain the flames of war, and Horus's vanguard burst into the Garmin star cluster. 10,000 dark and terrible shadows were released from the warp. These were warships with twisted outlines where the corruption of their master was reflected in the subtle distortions of the hull and prow armor. The vanguard, with traitors in tow, navigated the arc of the Via Solaris, losing only a dozen void ships, while brute forces and dark omens hastened their advance. However, the fleet was forced to transition into real space on the fringe of the Garmin cluster. As long as the auger needle on Beta Garmon 3 remained in loyalist hands, Horus and his minions were denied the freedom to roam the treacherous tides of the cluster at will. Space between the remote systems of Garmin was far from empty, for even the dark void between stars resonated with the discordant sounds of war. Around the vanguard, roving flotillas of warships illuminated the darkness, with blinding beams of lances clashing with each other, while on the dark backdrop, dying embers stood out against the shattered hulls of starships. All bore witness to the ferocity of the combat that surrounded them. The battle was so convoluted that the sheer volume of signals, desperate pleas for help, and exultant cries of victory overwhelmed the Vox systems and targeting systems on the ships of the vanguard, struggling to distinguish friend from foe. Squadron after squadron detached from the vast armada of Horus's vanguard, seeking fame in battle among clashing fleets, or to deliver warriors to some distant war zone among the indifferent stars of the cluster. Thousands of ships with hundreds of thousands of warriors descended upon the worlds of the Garmin star cluster, but they were no more than a catalyst, a sortie upon a fire already out of control. For there was not a single part of the Garmin cluster where the cries of battle did not already ring, not a single world that was not stained with blood, each one a prize to be claimed and brought to Horus's knees. What began as a strategic operation had now turned into a mere mad slaughter. War for the sake of bloodshed, killing for the contemplation of the skulls of the fallen. For there were so many that the victor could sit upon them, as on a massive and dreadful throne. Horus Lupercal was not the only warlord fighting for control over the ruins of the Imperium, who sought to turn the tide of war in his favour. Rogel Dawn, the Praetorian of Terror, was plotting his own offensive, and even as Horus's vanguard burst into the Garmin cluster, he was desperately gathering vast forces to hold back the traitors. To gather these warriors, he needed precious time, needed to ensure that Beta Garmon remained in the hands of the Loyalists. Using an astropathic beacon, he could direct his fleets through the tides of the fatal storm, and finally unleash the full might of the Imperium upon Horus and his rebellious forces. For this, Dawn deployed his hidden reserves, a force powerful enough to attract Horus's attention, yet not so important that its absence or even loss would jeopardize Terra's defense, or the counter-offensives he sought to assemble. To threaten the traitors, the force had to be led by the Legiones Astartes, and Dawn could spare only a few such warriors. Thus, the Iron Hands became his solution. Under the leadership of Iron Father Vilgus Dorak, a survivor of the ill-fated campaign on Istvan V, a new detachment was formed with the gene seed of Ferrus Manus. These warriors were fresh from the Apothecarian, with their scars from implantation still red and raw. But Dawn, without hesitation, dispatched them to Alans, a minor sector on the edge of the Garmin cluster. There they could replenish supplies and assemble auxiliary forces before heading to Beta Garmon 2 to confront the traitors. However, upon reaching Bearman 2, the capital world of the Alans cluster, the Iron Hands found it besieged by the Emperor's children. The orphaned sons of Ferrus Manus immediately descended into orbit to challenge them in battle. The Emperor's children did not attempt to counter the landing, showing no concern for these warriors. The two forces met at Palatan, the largest city on the planet. 3 long lines of warriors, clad in purple armor, each line consisting of several hundred men, formed up, with the lead column carrying a dozen massive ceremonial banners. The Emperor's children appeared as if they were on parade, not even bothering to secure the surrounding hills or the city's outskirts, their contempt for the enemy evident. The Iron Hands marched forward in 5 ragged, undisciplined columns, lacking heavy equipment but outnumbering the enemy. Seeing no enemy armoured vehicles, the Emperor's Children tank squadrons retreated to the far right flank. 24 Predator tanks and a pair of ornately decorated fallen blades watched the unfolding battle dispassionately. Moving at a quick march, the Iron Hands advanced through the swampy marshes in disorderly ranks, coming under precise volleys from the sons of Fulgrim. Each of the purple ranks fired in practiced order at the Loyalist column's advanced ranks, and 24 bodies clad in black armour fell into the murky water. However, the Iron Hands continued their advance, stepping over their dead. Their ranks suddenly tightened, and their pace quickened. The Iron Hands columns pivoted at an angle to the left edge of the enemy's line, and from behind them, several wedges of anti-gravity speeders launched forward, water fountaining as they accelerated to full speed. Expecting only a foolish charge and inglorious death from the Iron Hands, the Emperor's Children, caught off guard, desperately tried to change formation. The leftmost detachment of their echelon spread out to open fire on the speeders, but managed only a single volley before the combat speeders struck them. Ducking at the last moment, the Iron Hands pilots swept over the infantry, snapping shots with their weaponry and leaving the enemy disorganized, before descending on the Emperor's Children's armoured vehicles from the right. The Emperor's Children had not yet recovered from the sudden assault. Like a hammer striking from the curtain of water kicked up by the speeders, columns of warriors emerged, hitting the thin purple line hard. With their line broken, the Emperor's Children were forced into brutal, close combat, their pride drowned in the frothy mud, and their armour, caught off guard, was cleaved apart by point-blank melters. Meanwhile, on their flanks, ornate heraldic banners fell to the ground like bitter tears. Another force might have surrendered, a weaker one might have broken and fled, but the Emperor's Children fought to the last man. Even in defeat they clung to their pride, even as they lay dead. However, the Iron Hands collected their proud bodies and decapitated them all, then gathered the purple helmets into a heap and planted a clan banner among them. Now the Iron Father ruled this world, his warriors revelling in the taste of battle and victory, having also seized the war gear and war machines that once served the Emperor's Children. The news of the Iron Hand's success drew other Loyalist units into the cluster, including a Titan detachment from Legio Astorum under the command of Senioris var Harax. Within a few short months, the growing Loyalist forces of Space Marines, Solar Auxilia and Titans had liberated the cluster and were poised to strike at Beta Garmon. While the entire Garmon star cluster blazed around them, each individual world was consumed by its own war, every fleet striving for its own glory, and only the core vanguard of the traitors remained true to their orders. Bound by debt and fear of Horus, they rejected the blind violence that engulfed those waging war throughout the cluster and set course for the beating heart of Garmon, the Beta Garmon system. There a double prize awaited them, Nirkon City and the Seer's Needle, which Horus sought as keys that could finally bring Terra itself under his control. Even having lost minor forces and opportunistic raiders who once accompanied them, the ships of the vanguard still represented a formidable power. In the massive formation, over 6,000 major ships and even more escort vessels remained. This was a force sufficient to outmatch the Loyalist fleets, still hiding within the Beta Garmon system, in open combat. Instead, the Loyalists limited themselves to brief forays, swiftly striking at the flanks of the vast armada before retreating under the protection of the massive star fort that hovered in geosynchronous orbit over Beta Garmon, directly above Nirkon City. The star fort would become the first serious obstacle to the traitors' plans. While the Vanguard fleet could overwhelm this defense, they would suffer significant casualties, potentially so severe that any assault on Beta Garmon would be doomed to fail. However, left untouched, the numerous macro-cannon batteries prevented the traitors' ships from executing an orbital landfall directly onto Nirkon City. Unwilling to sacrifice the main part of their fleet in a futile attack, the traitor admirals adopted another strategy. Deploying fast cruisers and destroyers to protect the largest ships from Loyalist raids, they executed an orbital drop, in an unprotected region. All understood that there would not be a swift assault, only a long and exhausting ground campaign that would bleed both the loyalists and traitors dry. To capture Nurkan city, the vanguard fleet would first have to conquer half of Betrayal, and any conventional strategy would see them mired in war, possibly for many years. Such a delay would not please Horus, and none of the vanguard wished to endure the consequences of his displeasure. In such moments of danger, only the brave or the fools find opportunity, where others see only disaster. A leader from the 18th Company of the Sons of Horus, whom his subordinates sometimes called the Kinslayer, became the architect of the landing operation. A warrior whose fame was tied to a reckless and bloodthirsty willingness to sacrifice everything for victory, he became a commander due to his comrades' reluctance to face Horus's judgment. He ordered the Sons of Horus to prepare for an assault using drop pods and targeted the sprawling industrial hive located at the southernmost fringe of the equatorial zone. Considering the enormous size of the hive and its impressive network of defenses, everyone waging war on Betrayal II preferred to avoid the hive, as any attacker feared that victory would come at too high a price. However, the Sons of Horus were ordered to take positions while the fleet maneuvered in low orbit, before unleashing a volley upon volley of a rain of the Legion's drop pods into the upper atmosphere. The traitors surged toward their target, a vast cloud of ships and pods, engines working at full power to reach maximum speed, painted the horizon of Betrayal a blood-red hue, foretelling the horror that was once again to befall this world. The night sky above the hive city, illuminated by the engines of approaching landing crafts and the flurry of the defenders' gun salvos, resembled the sky at the break of dawn, yet it was still far from morning. Dozens of flame-engulfed capsules were torn apart, with the warriors inside perishing before they even realized they were under attack, and even more were destroyed as they crashed into the outer spires of the city. The assault commander established his landing zones in the unguarded districts of the city, bypassing the walls, but in doing so inflicted heavy casualties on his own forces, as the limited inertial guidance systems of the pods could not evade concentrated fire or sudden obstacles. Yet no one thought of the fallen, as only the impending battle mattered. Debris from both shattered landing craft and demolished spires rained upon the ranks of the defenders attempting to redeploy from the outer walls. The militia were equipped in the manner of the solar auxilia, yet they lacked the discipline of these elite forces, and they faltered in the face of the audacious assault by the Sons of Horus. The infantry was scattered across the kilometre-wide city districts, with each platoon isolated and separated from its allies. Their positions had been pre-scanned from orbit, after which squadrons of Deathstorm drop pods were dispatched to hunt them, their automated missile systems sowing death and panic among the militia forces, making the Loyalists easy prey for the Sons of Horus. Emerging from the landing zones, those Space Marines who survived the reckless insertion amid the hive's spires swiftly seized the initiative. Coordinated squads of the Sons of Horus advanced to locate the unwieldy crowds of militia, maneuvering through the urban landscape to encircle and annihilate the enemy in fierce firefights. The main objective of the Sons of Horus was the elimination of enemy commanders. It might have seemed reckless to direct all firepower towards the destruction of a single warrior, but the seasoned warriors knew well what an enemy without a leader meant. The only threat to the Space Marines' onslaught were the heavy tanks trailing the militia infantry. The massive tanks, Doomblade and Stormhammer, ideally suited for urban combat, rolled forward at close quarters, firing their cannons and annihilating squads of the Sons of Horus caught in the open. Fortunately, among the smaller craft were heavier landing ships whose doors swung open, releasing squads of Leviathan dreadnoughts. Amidst the narrow streets and steel and concrete canyons of the city, the dreadnoughts, engaged in close combat, were able to triumph over the tanks, as their power claws effortlessly tore through armor that was impervious to infantry volleys. The battle raged throughout the night, with the militia commanders sending wave after wave towards the outskirts, desperately trying to push back the Space Marines. Each densely packed wave became easy prey for the mobile units of the Sons of Horus. By the time the dawn began to break over the city, the streets were strewn with piles of corpses clad in blue and gold robes, among which occasionally lay bodies in green power armor. The militia was practically annihilated, and the city lost, with the only remnants of the fallen soldiers being the burning hulls of tanks and scattered islands of drop pods. The Kinslayer had secured his beachhead, though the chapter paid a terrible price for his victory. After the battle, when the guns fell silent, the leader redeployed the main part of the vanguard army onto the landing craft and warships. He unleashed the traitorous warriors upon the hive, driving the populace from their native home into the grim wastelands between the cities of Betrayal II. The few refugees who managed to reach one of the other cities of this world brought with them tales of death, sowing seeds of fear in the hearts of the defenders. The slightest breeze, a single misspoken word, could fan the flames of war into a raging inferno. But that same faint wind could not extinguish the awakened fire, which would burn until only ashes remained. The beachhead seized by the fierce warriors of the 18th chapter of the Sons of Horus was not the first attack by the traitors on Beta Garmon, and Midarchon was not the first of its cities to burn in the fires of the civil war. Across the narrow equatorial belt, where the planet's population could somehow subsist under the scorching sun of Beta Garmon, great and small battles raged. Since the Emperor's children brought war to Beta Garmon for the first time 6 long years ago, there had been no peace, as various hive cities warred amongst themselves. Some fought for Horus or the Emperor, believing themselves crucial cogs in the grand galactic conflict, while others battled purely for their own safety, indifferent to the loyalties of those who opposed them with weapons in hand, and the very worst sought to subjugate their neighbours out of sheer greed. The stronghold of the traitors, Anticon, located on the edge of the Great Eastern Rift, had forged its own small empire among the lesser hives, forcing the state of the eastern cities to war against each other. Now its regiments bore the eye of Horus and celebrated their vile conquests, through which their once insignificant home abounded with riches. Meanwhile, the bright Ferricon, once known as the City of Mirrors, had turned into an artillery-scarred battlefield, and its famed solar farms were reduced to shards and dust, covering those who fought for its wealth. The slow and inevitable death, along with the opportunity for looting and marauding, set neighbours against each other, and each battle only intensified the war. Millions upon millions had already perished, both warriors who took up arms and innocent civilians. With every new tragedy that engulfed Beta Garmon, the entire cluster became only worse. Only Nearchon maintained any semblance of sanity, serving as a beacon amidst the bloody curse that beset the inhabitants of Beta Garmon. Here, within the city's walls, order still reigned, and its inhabitants were inspired daily by the speeches of the governor Iriana Vale and the formidable presence of the loyal Space Marines on the city's ramparts. Nearchon was sufficiently armed to deter any minor warlord from attacking it, and thanks to its connection with the space fortress far above, it was protected from various raiders and could broadcast to the entire sector. Thus, it was precisely Nearchon that, according to Horus's demands, had to fall, for its destruction would lead to further chaos in the Garmon cluster. By gaining control of the city, the fleet of the War Master would be one step closer to the Sol System, Terra, and the Emperor's palace itself. Considering the city's strategic position, any direct assault on Nearchon would be suicidal, even for such a powerful force as that sent forth by Horus. Instead, the vanguard commanders decided to employ a more nuanced strategy of conquest. They divided their forces and began undertaking the dreadful task ahead of them. Vast columns of infantry, whose marching raised clouds of dust obscuring the horizon, roaring squadrons of tanks whose engines could be heard for kilometers, and titans whose war horns shattered the air with the traditional call of Legio Mortis, a call to war and slaughter. The warriors of the 49th chapter's 3rd Company of the World Eaters, known as the Torrent of Gore, set forth first. Over 1,000 warriors on spiked combat bikes and speeders with menacing close combat weapons hurtled along the southern boundary of the inhabited zone, aiming to flank Nearchon. Despite their speed, they struggled to keep pace with the main traitor forces, as the warriors of the 12th Legion sought to turn every settlement they passed into a bloody ruin, losing precious days to slaughter. The Titans of Legio Mortis were the last to advance to war. The main mass of forces, the Sons of Horus, the Death Guard, and the remaining World Eaters, whose endurance, ingrained in their genes, allowed them to outpace both the Solar Auxilia and militia forces, moved towards Verdus Terminus from the north. The Lords of Verdus, informed of the vanguard's ferocity by the survivors in Medakon, declared their surrender and desire for a truce as soon as the traitors' banners appeared on the horizon, but to no avail. Ordering their auxiliary forces to encircle the city, the Death Guard of the 9th Operative Group unleashed volleys of their artillery and toxic bombs upon it. For 3 long days, the vanguard ravaged Verdis Terminia, while bounty hunters repelled any attempts by desperate militia to break the cordon around the city. After hundreds of thousands perished, any semblance of order within the city's walls immediately crumbled. Afterward, the traitors entered Verdis Terminia and shackled all survivors, forcing them to march ahead of them. And the Titans of Legio Mortis, positioned at the rear of the army, halted to turn the hive into twisted wreckage, leaving behind nothing but ruins. After the destruction of Verdis, the Council of the City of Harkon declared its complete surrender long before the traitor forces reached its walls. Sensing disgust for the cowardice of those they had sworn to protect, the Titans of Legio Astorum within the city turned their weapons against the city's defences. Breaching the walls, they advanced to challenge the traitors rather than accept surrender. The Titans of Legio Mortis advanced to meet them, speeding past lesser warriors. They made no pretense of an honourable fight and threw all their might upon the enemy. The battle was brief and merciless. The loyal Titans were surrounded and bled dry, after which they were finally destroyed, and the traitors entered Harkon. Now the forces of the vanguard stood poised at the threshold of Nyakon, ready to assault the city, whose surrender was demanded by Horus. Many defenders of Nyakon pleaded with Lady Palatine and the imperial authorities on Beta Garmon II to dispatch warriors to the cities assailed by the traitorous host. Yet all these pleas were denied. Now, with the immense army of the War Master on the horizon's edge, the wisdom of this decision became evident, for Nyakon would need all of its warriors to withstand such an army. Guarded from above by a space fortress and from the surface by relic guns mounted on the city's outer redoubts, capable of crippling even the largest battle titans, Nyakon was isolated but far from vanquished. The might of its defences and the presence of Lady Palatine bolstered the city's morale. The city would not be willingly surrendered, and its warriors, sheltered from battle, yearned to demonstrate their strength to the traitors. Horus's servants faced a harsh choice: a slow, grueling siege, or a reckless assault on the city's prepared positions and heavy weaponry. If the captains of the vanguard wished to avoid Horus's wrath, neither option was suitable, and feigning preparation for a siege, they instead turned to the 18th chapter of the Sons of Horus to break the deadlock. The 18th chapter, having earned the title Crowned in Gold for a daring orbital descent, and the infantry comprising the chapter's main forces descended into the tunnels beneath the ruins of Harkon to prove their worth for such a high accolade. These tunnels connected the cities of Beta Garmon and once housed enormous transport arcs. However, at the outset of the conflict, most of these were blocked or rendered impassable with radioactive charges, preventing ordinary warriors from making use of them. The Space Marines of the 18th chapter, however, were far from ordinary mortals, and with the support of Death Guard veteran warriors, they broke through the tunnels and penetrated the outer districts of Nyakon from below. The barricades set up inside the city prevented the Sons of Horus from using armoured vehicles, and the catastrophic rad emissions sapped their strength, with many warriors losing heart. Even the Space Marines could not withstand the horrible poison eating away at their flesh. Yet, after an entire day of crawling through the bowels, the survivors found themselves in the catacombs of the terminal station of the Nyakon Magnetic Railway. Although their armour was corroded by the radiation and etched with numerous grooves, The weapons of the legionnaires were at the ready. Emerging into the vast halls of the terminal, hundreds of warriors, whose power armor heraldry had turned into a grey blur, engaged two cohorts of militia, shaking the terminal's metre-thick walls with their battle. Initially, the militia mistook the warriors in grey armour for allies, rendering themselves defenceless and vulnerable. The Gilded Ones took advantage of this, imposing close combat on the enemy, where their skills significantly outweighed their opponents' numbers. The crackling volleys of laser fire carved through the dense ranks of power-armoured warriors, but failed to halt their rapid advance, forcing the militia into retreat to avoid annihilation, ceding the terminal to the enemy. The broad avenues for various processions surrounding the terminal soon echoed with the clamour of battle, the roar of bolters and the crack of laser guns, as the defenders attempted to stem the tide of warriors in grey armour. Here in the open city, the warriors of the Solar Auxilia and Militia brought their heavy artillery into play, destroying improvised strongpoints and forcing the traitors to switch to defence. Dragging only infantry and small artillery installations through the ruined tunnels, the Gilded Ones and their allies found themselves at a disadvantage, and while they surpassed the defenders' infantry in skill and ferocity, they could not match their heavy weaponry. Each attempt by the traitors to break out of the terminal was slowed by the deep ranks of Solar Auxilia infantry and then halted by the fire of heavy artillery. Thanks to the persistence of the militia, who earned the nickname the Immortals, the Sons of Horus remained trapped and vulnerable. The gambit of the traitors seemed to have failed, trapped as they were in the terminal, and Lady Palatine Vale ordered her reserve formations stationed along the outer walls to engage. To support the militia, Imperial Fist units began gathering in the city's centre, but the Loyalist generals deemed that their assistance would not be necessary. However, the assault on the terminal, the most obvious target for the initial attack, proved to be nothing more than a diversionary manoeuvre. When the Loyalists withdrew their forces from the towers and walls, squadrons of White and Crimson Storm Eagle and Fire Raptor ships swept over the wastelands, flying mere meters above the jagged rocks. Although several ships failed to avoid collisions with the cliffs, instantly turning into fireballs, and others were shot down by the cannons on the city's walls, the speed and suicidal altitude of the remaining ships protected them from the vast relic weapons. The landing vessels passed over the avenues surrounding the city, shelling the suddenly vulnerable artillery and destroying an infantry detachment, then unleashed a horde of warriors clad in crimson armour from the World Eaters' Legion upon the city's outer districts. The ferocious warriors, known as the Red Tide, dispersed into the landing zones with no regard for military logic. The legionnaires lacked the discipline of the Sons of Horus and were indifferent to the shrewd use of terrain or tactics. It seemed as though their sole concern was bloodshed and slaughter. Ignoring the breaches torn in their ranks by enemy artillery, the Red Tide warriors charged at the defenders, striving to dispute their title of Immortals, regardless of the bloody price they would have to pay. And for a brief time, the battle turned into a massacre. Emerging from the terminal, the Sons of Horus and the Death Guard broke through the Loyalist ranks and advanced towards the Amethyst Tower, a pivotal defensive stronghold of the city, where one of the mighty relic guns restraining the enemy Titans was located. The legionaries of the World Eaters, lost to their love for bloodshed and thirst for blood, remained to finish off the scattered cohorts of the Solar Auxilia, more concerned with the harvest of lives they so craved than with any strategic achievements. Meanwhile, at the foot of the Amethyst Tower, the Sons of Horus fought, attempting to secure themselves on its walls, while the Death Guard's warsmiths sought to plant charges in the cavities blasted into the massive structure. Had they had more time, the grim warriors of Barbarous would have destroyed the tower and the enormous gun within it. But as the defenders held the traitors within the outer redoubts of the tower, they could only damage its operating and targeting systems. The tower was saved from complete destruction by the arrival of militia and warriors from the Nemesis Brigade, most of whose companies were supported by armoured transports. Using heavily armed vehicles as improvised artillery to clear the positions of the Space Marines, the militia paved the way for the fire teams of the Nemesis Brigade, forcing the traitors to retreat by raining volleys of Volkite beams upon the enemy. However, the damage was already done, and although the Death Guard failed to utterly obliterate the tower, they left it blinded and powerless. When the massive cannon on the Amethyst Tower lowered, its systems temporarily disabled, the main mass of the traitorous forces miles from the city sprang into motion. Not wishing to risk their Titans, several thousand Space Marines, having mounted their Land Raiders, raced forward, hoping to reach the outer walls and secure a foothold in Nurkan City before the relic artillery could be reactivated. With no other forces at their disposal, and unwilling to commit their Titans to avoid forcing the traitor's hand, the Lady ordered her generals to mobilize armored divisions. As the cloud of dust raised by the traitor's armored spear rose on the horizon, more than 1,000 Lehman Russ battle tanks and Malkador assault tanks emerged to meet them. In the outer districts of the city, the fighting was no less fierce, as the militias and Nemesis brigades managed to surround isolated legionnaires of the Sons of Horus and the Death Guard, and pinned them back to the gates of the Amethyst Tower. The red tide was raging in all hub districts. The fury of the World Eaters was such that they began slaughtering everything in their path, sating their bloodlust not only on the remains of the immortal defenders, but also on the inhabitants of Nurkan City, trapped in their homes. As the Imperial Fists refused to abandon the defense of the inner districts of the city and the Silver Tower, there remained only one force capable of opposing the warriors of the 12th Legion. Without waiting for orders, the Blood Angels left their positions along the southern wall and the Jade Tower, which the traitors carefully avoided, and moved into battle. Shouting ancient battle cries of unity, about 3,000 Blood Angels descended upon the residential areas of the outer city, where the World Eaters raged in a literal cascade of crimson. What followed was scarcely a battle, resembling more an enormous brawl, as the two forces, known for their ferocity and mastery in weaponry, met in the narrow streets and open squares of the outer districts. Not attempting to form battle lines and formations, both sides collided in a swirling flood of blades and blood, yielding not an inch and caring little for the devastation they wrought upon the city around them. Similarly, on the plains beyond the city, tank crews closed in point-blank with their adversaries, striving to negate the advantage of the Space Marines' deadly las cannon, leaving behind scores of wrecked tanks. The engagement devolved into a battle of attrition, where neither side could maneuver to gain an advantage, leaving the warriors on the battlefield to hope that their enemy would break under their assault before they were all slain. Had the battle persisted, it was likely both armies would have been annihilated as fighting formations and the city around them destroyed. But this did not come to pass. Unfurling their banners and holding them high, the ranks of the Imperial Fists finally entered the fray. Owing to the time gained through the sacrifices of other warriors, the Imperial Fists were fully prepared for war. Squadrons of Rhinos and Land Raiders deployed infantry with heavy weaponry and armored Terminator warriors to strike and drive back the battered remnants of the Sons of Horus. Meanwhile, line infantry established a perimeter around the residential quarters. On the plains beyond the city, seeing their allies retreating and banners falling, the traitors' armoured spearhead reluctantly began to withdraw. Their leaders understood that any victory achieved now would cost them more than the price of defeat. As they retreated, they left behind the shattered remnants of militia. For these brave warriors managed to delay the traitors, but only at the cost of horrific losses in both men and machinery. Only 9 Lehman Russ tanks left the battlefield and returned to the city. Outraged that the tanks were allowed to withdraw after such a grueling victory, a Warlord-class battle titan of the Legio Mortis advanced, sounding its war horns, challenging the tanks. The massive war machine fired one salvo at the distant walls, reaching the edge of the empty wasteland before the city when a tremendous blast of coherent energy tore it apart. The ancient cannon of the Amethyst Tower was fully restored, once again preventing the Titans from unleashing their wrath upon the city. As the shattered remains of the Titan fell upon the wasteland, the traitor generals sent coded vox signals across all channels, ordering a retreat, striving to preserve as much strength as possible for the long war to come. The fall of the Titan marked the end of the first assault on Nirkon, and the forces of the traitors outside the walls retreated to their fortified camp for regrouping. Of the traitor forces still within the walls, a few exhausted columns of the Sons of Horus and the World Eaters managed to break through to the city centre, fleeing from the fresh reinforcements of loyalists from the Imperial Fists. While the Sons of Dawn battered the thick walls of the terminus, the traitors either took shelter in tunnels with the aid of radioactive emissions or engaged in a desperate aerial evacuation. From the vaulted roof of a building, as several squadrons and assault eagles arrived, fearless of the heavy barrage, to rescue as many of their brethren as possible. The remaining traitors in the city occupied makeshift strongpoints in residential blocks and fought on for several more hours until the Solar Auxilia's artillery breached their improvised fortresses, after which the assault forces eliminated them. As a result, only the residential sectors south of the centre remained lost, where the main contingent of World Eaters who had not left the battlefield continued to engage in a brutal skirmish with the Blood Angels. This conflict endured for 3 more days, during which the Blood Angels, with a twisted sense of pride, would track and kill every enemy warrior, taking no prisoners and leaving few bodies for the Imperial Fists to inspect. Indeed, the horrific carnage that unfolded in these residential districts was so great that the Imperial Fists isolated this area and made no attempts to reinforce their blood-spattered allies, simply leaving the zone encircled until the unrestrained sons of Sanguinius exhausted their fury. Reports of the horrors committed in the abandoned areas reached the council, causing protests in some parts of the inner city. An official protest was filed with the commander of the Imperial Fists, as the de facto leader of all Astartes' forces in the city, and although no response from the Blood Angels followed, they were banned from appearing in the inner quarters of the city. This wedge between the embittered warriors of the Solar Auxilia, troubled by the brutal actions of the Blood Angels and the apparent indifference of the Imperial Fists and the Astartes warriors, was just one of many stains on the banner of victory attained. During the battles, several Alpha Legion spies infiltrated the city who, in the weeks following the first assault, launched waves of sabotage, destroying city districts, and their campaign of disinformation and propaganda led to the creation of several insurgent groups within the city. The Imperial Fists went so far as to declare their direct control over several key areas of the city, quelling any protest attempts with bloody repression. Entire guilds suspected of treachery were exiled to the outer residential areas, where the Blood Angels still prowled, and the once inspiring speeches of Lady Palatine began to take on an increasingly grim tone. Victory brought no relief, only a numb anticipation of the horror that everyone now knew would follow in its wake. After the first assault, an impenetrable darkness descended upon Nirkon's city. Neither side dared to engage in major confrontations without some tangible advantage, but small raids and probing attacks were conducted by both the Loyalists and the traitors with monotonic regularity. Companies of scouts, bounty hunters, attacked and ravaged remote settlements, and tank squadrons roamed the wasteland, annihilating traitor patrols while attempting to map out the walls and positions of defending warriors. But worst of all were the raids by the Blood Angels. Small detachments of the 9th Legion, under the cover of night or during dust storms, breached the perimeter of the traitor camp, and the only evidence of their attacks were the half-eaten remains of the slain. The war around the isolated city engulfing Beta-Garmon II was becoming ever more desperate and horrific. The only Vox signals reaching the besieged capital were those of horror, destruction and torment, frantic cries for help to which they could not respond, as the armies of traitors awaited at their doorstep. Any attempt to rush to aid other loyal forces would guarantee the fall of Nirkon along with the doomed allies. Only Lady Palatine and the dispassionate praetor of the Legion Astartes heard these last pleas for the protection of the Emperor, and only they fully understood the depths to which Beta-Garmon II had fallen. At the far edge of this forsaken world, seas boiled under the orbital bombardments of the traitor fleet, and the flooded hive cities died a slow and terrible death. Isolated spires broadcast for several days as they slowly sank and crumbled. Even the small, dusty towns scattered along the habitable zone's edge, whose tiny domes barely had enough power for their Vox transmitters, lamented their end as the world eaters from the relentless tide tore them apart. The constant barrage of suffering, both these and many others, served as a weapon far mightier than any cannon aimed at the very heart of Nurkan City. The consequences of this subtle war were felt throughout the city, and although Lady Palatine forbade the spread of such dreadful news, it could not be fully concealed, whether from the hands of Alpha Legion spies or well-intentioned citizens of Nurkan with access to their own Vox devices. Discontent spread and engulfed the city. The militia was tasked to leave the walls and begin patrolling the streets. Now their enemies were both the people they protected and the traitors at the gates. The city had become a prison, with the inner quarters trembling with fear, shaken by the thudding of boots, while the outer, where the blood angels maintained order with the point of a blade, were consumed by death. Even though the traitors had not launched any true assaults for several weeks, it seemed that the city had already fallen, merely awaiting the executioner's final axe blow. Among the more prosaic records of the war for Beta Garmon, other repositories of information can be found concerning the events that led to the Great Slaughter. Within them are the classified Vox recordings of the Command Hall of the Silver Tower, where Lady Palatine Vale held court with the generals of the militia and other armed forces gathered for the city's defence. On the day of the second traitor assault, these records detail a different battle, not one of weapon and blade, but of conscience and duty. Here, Lady Vale wrestled with the necessity of exterminating the people of Garmon to preserve her city, either chastising her generals for their inability to annihilate the traitors or quelling her own fear to fulfill her duty to the Imperium. Ultimately, Lady Vale dismissed all militia officers and auxiliary forces from her sight, refusing to give a final command. And it seemed that this battle would conclude on that same day. Then the records indicate a new identification code permitted entry into the command room, Warrior Code of the Legiones Astartes. Vox records reflect a full 3 minutes of silence following the warrior's entry, followed by a brief monologue delivered with a distinctive accent. Duty is never a light burden because you must carry it alone. No one will thank you for bearing it, and no history will record the trials you have endured. I will not tell you what you must do because you already know it. I will not lie and tell you that it is right because we both know it is not. But it must be done so that in the future others will not have to bear the same burden. Now I'll go to the wall to bear my own. The Legiones Astartes identification code is then used again, and the legionary departs the room. And less than a minute later, Lady Vale gives the order to open fire. The traitors, however, did not sit idly by while Nurkan City awaited them on the horizon. For several weeks they sent their raiders, but not for futile assaults on the high walls of Nurkan, but to other, less fortified hives. Small hunting packs of titans easily breached the walls of smaller hives, after which the brutal wars of the World Eaters entered to obtain what the lords of the vanguard now sought. A new breed of weaponry for waging war. New means by which the walls of Nurkan could be shattered and Horus's desire fulfilled. Something different than guns and blades. Now that the city stood on the brink of rebellion and its defenders were plagued with doubt, it was time to unleash this weapon. 5 weeks after the initial failed attack, dawn broke over the wastelands, and alarms sounded along Nurkan's western walls. A massive cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, a sign that vast forces were on the march and moving directly toward the city. Scanners on the walls and high towers were quickly activated, revealing the full horror of the traitors' new strategy. An approaching army, countless in number. But it was no phalanx of space marines nor a cohort of solar auxilia. It was a wave of civilians, the ragged remnants of city populaces, driven upon Nurkan as a weaponless battering ram clad in rags, their numbers immeasurable. 1 million, or possibly more, all seeking the safe walls of Nurkan, propelled forward by the artillery guns of the traitors. For a moment, the artillery crews on the walls hesitated. These were not warriors. They were people of Garmon, desperate and in need of aid. Yet there were so many refugees that the city could not shelter them, for to admit them all would be to doom Nirkon. The defenders might as well have opened the gates to Horus himself. Minutes passed, and the command frequency on the military Vox channels of Nirkon remained silent until an order was transmitted, accompanied by the verified identification code of Lady Palatine herself, and it was simple: open fire. Despite the order, the guns on the walls were silent. The militia refused to fire upon the defiant mass rushing towards the walls. When the guns finally opened up, it was not the warriors of Garmon behind them, but iron hands. The grim sons of Medusa were well aware of the bitter necessity of war, and, although they took no pleasure in what had to be done, they would not allow the traitors to claim victory in any form, whatever the cost. Shells rained down on the plain, throwing vast plumes of ash and torn bodies skyward, while along the walls the defenders still hesitated, trying to avert defeat. The fierce bombardment revealed not only the determination of the loyalists on the walls, but also the true treachery of the traitors. As shells began to fall on the massive horde of war-weary people, the warriors on the walls came under retaliatory fire. Among the endless throng, contingents of headhunters, both infantry and self-propelled artillery, lay hidden. The Earthshaker cannons did not halt their advance, but shifted to combat speed, firing as they moved forward, crushing those who lagged behind or could not keep up. Their shots lacked precision, but little was needed to strike the vast walls of Nirkon, and the endless stream of desperate people they hid within made it almost impossible for the defenders to return fire, fearing that the seething mass before them was so great that even artillery could not destroy it before the traitors reached the walls, and the call to arms was sounded in earnest. The warriors rushed to take positions along the walls, reinforced by iron hands, while Blood Angels' contingents began amassing among the city's ruins. Throughout the city, forces were summoned to bolster the western defences, and even the Imperial Fists in the inner districts and the starport abandoned their fortifications to join the counterattack. Judging by their fierce determination, the Loyalists had uncovered the enemy's plans, and the traitors hidden among the horde and before the walls seemed unwilling to attack once their ruse was revealed. Instead, they exchanged long-range fire with the guns on the walls, driving the captives they dragged onto this battlefield and refusing to engage in open combat. It was a staggering massacre. Guns roared from both sides, and the death toll climbed with each passing minute. None of the found records show whether what followed was an accident, a cruel twist of fate that so often governs war, or if it had long been planned by the traitor generals. At the moment when the cannons roared from the far wall of the city, an army of the World Eaters, known as the Swift Tide, emerged from the southern wastelands. About 1,000 warriors on war bikes, anti-gravitational speeders, and land raiders traversed the perilous lands beyond the habitable zone and were now approaching the city from the side opposite to the main attack. Before them lay the spaceport, a vital link to the orbital star fort and an essential part of the city's infrastructure. Moreover, its defenders had already redeployed to support the western walls, leaving only a small contingent to face the World Eaters. Ranked warriors of the Solar Auxilia, in matte black uniforms of the Nemesis Brigade, hurried to take positions, sending crackling volleys of last bolts at the enemy. And though a few of the Space Marines tumbled from their bikes, raising clouds of dust, the warriors of the Tide were too swift for the Solar Auxilia to focus their fire and halt their attack. Bursting into the dense ranks of Loyalists, the World Eaters smashed their formation and scattered the survivors with point-blank fire and chain blades, while several squads of frenzied warriors pursued the fleeing enemy. Leaving behind the fiercest elements, the main force of the Tide turned toward the spaceport, now defended by only one company of the Solar Auxilia. This was an advanced company of celebrated veterans of the Great Crusade, well aware of the capabilities of the Astartes warriors. Instead of fighting in tight formation, as was customary, the warriors of the 5th Company fought in small squads, each supported by one or more heavy tanks with deadly blades and storm hammers, earning the nickname colossi. The weapons of the super-heavy tanks held back the swift tide, allowing the 5th Company's infantry to saturate the attackers with las fire, repelling one assault after another. Though this tactic kept the enemy at bay, it could not stop their advance. And thwarting their attack, the World Eaters simply bypassed the isolated Solar Auxilia force and raced past them to the spaceport. When the assault on the spaceport concluded, chaos reigned on the Loyalist command channels. Commanders on the western walls called for reinforcements, while those in the spaceport frantically countermanded those orders, leaving many units in the inner city unaware of where they were needed. The militia were hopelessly confused, and their undisciplined officers could not comprehend the ever-changing deployment orders. Transit points in the city quickly became congested with soldiers attempting to traverse the entire city, thwarting any efforts to respond to the shifting battle. Worse still, traitors took position on the western approaches, emboldened by the sudden appearance of the World Eaters, seizing the moment to intensify their attack, finally launching forward. The defenders along the western walls intensified their barrage, but many of their salvos merely thinned the horde of captives the traitors drove before them, and failed to break the phalanxes of the headhunters. The remaining tank squadrons roared out from the outskirts to engage in battle, but they found themselves unable to maneuver amid the seething mass of bodies and evade the fire of the Sons of Horus, swiftly approaching the battle line from the rear. As a result of their numerical superiority, the traitor army reached the edge of the city's outlying districts, where the wall guns could no longer target them, and the headhunters, with a savage roar, finally charged into battle, brandishing the barbaric iconography of their brutal homeworld, draped from numerous standards. At first it seemed as though no force could stand against the traitors, and the first infantry units, sworn loyal to Horus, moved through the narrow streets of the outer districts with their artillery pieces. Only after the traitors broke their formation and entered the city did the Blood Angels strike. Utilizing the terrain to offset their smaller numbers, the Blood Angels dashed into battle, suppressing the larger, more cumbersome formations with volleys of bolter fire and streams of flame from flamers. Yet, the enemy's numbers were such that the Blood Angels suffered grievous losses to halt the advance, and even their fierce skills could not turn the traitors back with a single blow. The battle on the Western Front devolved into close combat and point-blank exchanges, and neither side yielded even in the face of total annihilation. Both the western and eastern flanks of Nirken's outer defences were breached. In the west, the Blood Angels were driven back by superior enemy forces, followed by massive contingents of Sons of Horus and Death Guard, advancing across plains so densely cluttered with bodies of the dead that the ground was no longer visible. Relic cannons on the outer towers could not repel this assault, as their task was to contain the Titans of Legio Mortis, being the only threat to those terrifying machines of war. In the east, the spaceport was riddled by fire groups from the traitor legions. Militiamen struggled to hold positions against the Legiones Astartes, who had now brought in land raiders with Terminators to take on heavy tanks. The outer defences had fallen. This was clear to commanders on both sides. The question now was only whether this meant the city itself was doomed. Fortunately for the Emperor's warriors, the strategies of the Imperial Fists had long anticipated such an eventuality. Ever since the legionaries had seized the city 2 years prior, they had prepared a series of contingency plans, and now, at last, a signal came to initiate one of them. On the signal, the soldiers stationed along the western walls vacated their posts, not to engage in the battle on the outer fronts, but to retreat through the city to the inner walls, avoiding entanglement with the enemy and becoming bogged down in combat. While they evacuated, the Iron Hands detonated a series of skillfully placed neutron charges, undermining the foundations of the outer walls along the western perimeter of the city from within, and causing them to collapse outward onto the ranks of traitors assembling beneath them for assaults. Enormous slabs crashed down, crushing tanks and infantry, raising a dense cloud of dust that thwarted any attempts by the traitors to regroup. Finding themselves beyond the walls, several surviving squadrons seized the opportunity to disengage and retreated into the wastelands. Reluctant to squander their lives and war machines in a futile battle against the numerically superior armor of the Sons of Horus, the Blood Angels in the outer districts were unable to withdraw, as they needed to hold back the traitors' advance while their brethren regrouped at the inner wall. Their small detachments divided, utilizing the abandoned residential quarters for waging an offensive battle to slow the enemy, striking isolated squads, and then retreating to safety for regrouping. In the eastern part of the city, the traitors' attention was focused on the spaceport, granting the units on the outer walls enough time to withdraw completely. However, the veteran warriors of the 5th cohort were cut off and surrounded, yet they were too valuable a resource to abandon. Aiding them came the mobile squadrons of the Imperial Fists, who used heavily armored Spartan assault tanks to break gaps in the fluid line of the World Eaters. The Spartans deployed the yellow-clad Space Marines to maintain a passage to the inner walls, while the massed bolter fire restrained the encircling bikes of the 12th Legion. Once the heavy tanks of the 5th cohort disengaged, the Imperial Fists made a final gambit, fearing to leave the spaceport in the hands of the traitors. An entire company of Terminators in yellow-black armor stormed into the spaceport, fending off constant attacks from the World Eaters and the panicked crowds of civilians seeking to escape the advancing traitors. They moved toward the landing pad on the far northern edge of the port facilities. There rested a Legiones Astartes destroyer, small enough to land in the port, but large enough to transport a company of Space Marines. However, the Imperial Fists had no intention of fleeing the battle. Instead, command codes were employed to overload the warp engine, initiating an uncontrollable tear in the very fabric of space. Meanwhile, on the storm-ravaged and poison-ridden world of Beta Garmin 3, war had sunk its claws just as deep as on the second world of this system. Here, the treacherous servants of Horus had ruled from the early days of the war through bribery and threats, swaying the city lords to their side. The forces still rallying under the banners of the Emperor's unity were worn and battered by numerous foes, and their sole bastion was the ancient capital Caldera Primus. As on Beta Garmin 2, the war here lived a life of its own, and rage consumed all strategy and any other goals save for slaughter. It was a brutal deadlock, in which an endless count of the dead was the sole measure of victory. The only thing that remained untouched amidst this carnage was the Seer's Spire. This is a sky-piercing tower, housing the greatest astropathic choir in the Garmin cluster, a treasure that drove armies to fight over the barren lands of Beta Garmin 3. Neither side could risk damaging the spire, as it would greatly complicate the transfer of fleets to and from the Garmin cluster, closing access to reinforcements for both sides. Therefore, it was the only haven of peace amidst an ocean of despair, a focal point for refugees fleeing the combat. It was this beacon that held the wandering armies in a fragile stalemate, for neither loyalists nor traitors had sufficient advantage to capture the spire without risking its destruction. But all was to change with the sudden and unexpected arrival of Iron Father Darek and his young Iron Hands. Darek brought not only his warriors, but also several companies of salamanders. Even more impressive were the Titans of Legio Astorum who, though they did not deign to name the Iron Father as their leader, agreed to accompany his forces into battle. Together they numbered over 500,000 battle-hardened warriors, a force enough to shift the balance of power on Beta Garmin 3 and alter the death toll in favor of the Loyalists. The relatively insignificant hive city of Naldera was the first to feel their wrath. A swarm of black and green pods descended upon it, engaging the small garrison of iron warriors and militia in brutal close combat. Taken by surprise, the Iron Warriors suffered heavy losses and ordered their auxiliary forces to hold the defence while they retreated to other nearby cities. However, few of the militia survived this battle, and subsequently, the Loyalists did not wait for the deployment of heavy landing transports. Instead, Darek ordered orbital ships to land on the planet, making it clear to his forces that there would be no retreat, only victory or death. Yet this was not a suicidal assault, for Darek chose Naldera as his first conquest. considering not only its immediate vulnerability. The small hive city was isolated from the most populated areas of Beta Garman III. And since the traitors could not use air transports in such foul atmospheric conditions, it was shielded from immediate counterattack. However, Darek did not intend to wait in relative safety while his enemies regrouped, and columns of land raiders and heavy transports, resilient to the poisoned atmosphere of Beta Garman III, roared out of Naldera. The warriors of Darek once again proved their might in Fortis, a small hive heavily fortified to withstand the fierce winds and torrential caustic rains brought from the sea. Here, the garrison of the Emperor's children once again refused to treat the newly forged warriors of the Iron Hands as equals. Instead of meeting the Iron Hands in honest open combat, they deployed Imperial Army regiments under their control, calculated insults against the loyalist warriors besieging the hive. The understrength regiments of the Dark Alliance, exhausted by the toxic air of Beta Garman III, were swiftly obliterated by the battle-hardened warriors of the Iron Hands, who then advanced to the spire itself. Deprived of support forces and trapped within the city, the Emperor's children were annihilated piecemeal over the course of 3 days of continuous assault, as the Iron Hands isolated and burned each of their redoubts, countering practiced elegance with unrelenting brutality. These and many other skirmishes across the wastelands of Beta Garman III sapped the traitors' strength, drawing them into countless minor battles. However, the commanders of Horus's forces considered the loss of a few outposts no more than an annoyance, as it did not threaten their dominion over Beta Garman III. But everything changed in the hive once known as Cardaron, which the Emperor's children had renamed Grande Ur in honor of their primarch. There, Darek conducted a daring frontal assault on the traitors and overcame them in a grinding war of attrition. After the battle, the Iron Hands toppled the majestic statue of Fulgrim, newly erected at the city gates. The standing sons of Medusa watched with jubilation as the 100-meter effigy fell, then took its head as a war trophy. Enraged by this affront, the Emperor's children unleashed the full might of the Beta Garman III traitors upon Darek's forces. On the vast, lightning-scarred plains between the ruins of Granda and the city of Borean, the Emperor's children displayed the last of their former might. 600 armoured vehicles in purple and gold liveries clashed with the black tanks of the Iron Hands, holding back the Loyalists for hundreds of kilometres while their allies gathered in Thanasi. For in that distant city, giants had assembled. About 100 battle titans of Legio Furion and Krytos gathered to expel the Loyalists, absolutely confident in themselves, for who could stand against them? The titans departed with triumph. Thunderous booms of war horns marked their departure, and alongside them knights galloped, raking the toxic wastelands. These titanic war machines moved with a speed few could match. However, before they could aid the besieged Emperor's children, they encountered another foe. Loyalist titans from 3 legios, Solaria, Astorum and Defensa, awaited in the vast dormant crater of the Crimson Moor, and their combined numbers nearly equaled those of the traitors. The titans of Legio Astorum, accompanying Dorak, joined the few who still held fast on Caldera Primus, and now sought to challenge the enemy in open combat for the last time. The ensuing clash was of truly epic proportions. The collisions of monstrous war machines amidst the lightning and hurricane winds of Beta Garman III, and the volleys of their weapons could be seen even in distant cities. Thrice the traitor titans launched themselves across the crater at the Loyalists standing on the high ground, but each time they were thrown back. Refusing to admit defeat, they attacked again. By the battle's end, the crater was littered with the broken corpses of titans and the scattered wreckage of their wrath. Such a dreadful landscape left even the victors broken by the scale of the destruction they had wrought. Out of the masses of titans that entered the battle, only a few dozen retreated to their positions to lick their wounds. After the victory at the Crimson Moor, the Loyalists seized the dominant position on Beta Garman III. The Emperor's children, finally realizing the ruinous nature of pride, abandoned the war of attrition with the Iron Hands and withdrew, wounded but not yet defeated. The war on Beta Garman entered a new phase, with the traitors now forced into a defensive stance, destroying entire cities to protect the territory they still controlled and exacting brutal vengeance on their enemies. However, for a brief period, Caldera Primus became a bastion for the Loyalists, with lost souls from across the system coming to its defense.